Hello and welcome to Maiden Mother Matriarch. My guest today is the writer and cultural historian Tiffany Jenkins. She's previously written books on museums and the moral questions raised by exhibiting or retaining certain artefacts. In that spirit, she's also a trustee of the British Museum and a radio presenter, including of the BBC Radio 4 series The History of Secrecy. Her latest book is Strangers and Intimates, The Rise and Fall of Private Life. We spoke about the shift in attitudes towards privacy that took place in Britain during the 18th century, why urbanisation causes intense anxiety over the boundaries around private life, historical attitudes towards abortion as a private matter, the politicisation of privacy in the second half of the 20th century, and the rise of the therapeutic state, which necessarily intrudes into the private lives, even the emotional lives of its citizens. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you enjoyed the conversation. I guess we should start by talking about the historical strangeness of viewing privacy as something essential or even as a human right. So you start the book by talking about antiquity, where this idea that you would have a right to private information, the whole private areas of your being was not a given. And it makes our contemporary view of it seem quite strange.
Yes, very much so. You had a situation in Athens. I mean, there was a strict divide between public life and private life, which was very much contingent upon the idea of public man, the citizen, the free adult man who would go to war, who would do the great heroic acts and public speech and all the things that we think of. In fact, when we think of that period, the buildings, for example, the Acropolis on the hill in Athens. These are all public buildings, and all the private homes have gone. They've deteriorated because they just weren't important. They were essential for the life, maintenance of life and religion. People worshipped there, but it was seen as a sort of uncivilized place, and you wouldn't have had the sense that we do of the individual needing protection from the authorities or from the community. I think people were highly surveilled, and that really continued in different forms up until the early modern period. And even then, you had this sense, and I'm thinking of something like around sort of 1700, that you should do nothing privately that you wouldn't do publicly. The idea that you would have this sort of space to retreat where you'd be different and free from the eyes either of God, each other, or some sort of authority, be it the king or the pope. That was anathema. It wouldn't have even sort of entered people's minds, I think.
What about the other aspect of privacy, which is, I guess, physical privacy? So the idea of going to the toilet in private or having sex in private, things like all the physical stuff. How has that historically been viewed? Because obviously people in the past lived much more cheek by jowl than we do now.
I think toilet and sex has always been... there has always been some sort of line between what you do in front of others and what you do on your own. And toilet and sex are certainly two of those things. But even there's variables. So if you've ever gone along Hadrian's Wall...
I was just thinking of that, yeah.
Yes. And everybody's always struck by the toilets, which are alongside each other. And in more kind of like an emperor's home, for example, they'd be finely decorated. And I think it was just a lot more open. And equally sex, if you go to Pompeii, there's much more kind of visual description of it in somebody's home, and maybe a room for the prostitutes and all the rest of it. So, and then taking up to the 17th century, the sense that it would be private, as in sex, was people might have done it might have had their own kind of bedrooms, although you might have a servant in front of you, but it was very much it was seen as something that the community would have to regulate. And spying through peepholes was entirely acceptable, and in fact almost mandated. You'd have to spy on each other because the consequences of a pregnancy, say you're unmarried, would be very serious. The community would have to take care of that child. And obviously you've got very sort of highly regulated moral and religious lives. So spying was a very much an ordinary, common thing to do.
Yeah, you've made me think again of royalty in particular, who obviously have they are obviously different in very important ways, and the sexual lives of royalty are of crucial importance to the nation in the way that it's not so true for normal people. But even then, it is very strange, like the way that it's portrayed in Sofia Coppola's Marie Antoinette film, which is very good. The level of court intrusion into sexual life. You don't dress yourself. I don't know if Marie Antoinette had a groom of the stool, but I know that Henry VIII.
Henry VIII did.
Indeed, yes, my 4-year-old always finds that very funny.
But I think the thing is with the royals, and this is a really important point, because actually you might be extraordinarily wealthy, but your life was very, very public because your authority was based on your private self, your biology, who you were.
Yeah.
And so kind of proving that in public, particularly around dressing and pregnancy, was crucial to the lineage, really. So Marie Antoinette does give birth moderately in public. And they, her one of her ladies in waitings talks about, how a chimney sweep stood upon a chair and everybody's sort of trying to peer over her to see what's happening. And this, you had to prove that that she really did give birth, and that that it was a legitimate child. Yeah. So the personal was political then.
Yeah, to accelerate to the 20th century, but we're not there yet. The corridor, you write about this as an interesting example, and I always think the same when you go to old buildings, that you are constantly walking through bedrooms, and this, again, this physical privacy issue, it seems to just not have factored in. There was no reason why they couldn't build corridors. They chose not to.
Exactly. It's a conceptual thing. There was no sense in which
it's not
big
technological.
Old castles. It's conceptual. And yes, it does come in as you begin to see the separation of public and private life. Public life with the coffee houses, newspapers, embryonic political parties. Private life in terms of the household being separated from the market. So people going out to buy things and working rather than doing everything within the home. And that's when the corridor is first introduced, I think, early into Blenheim Palace, and it later comes into the average home. But it's amazing because when we walk around those houses, we just think the early houses without the corridor, it just looks beautiful because you have this long room with these kind of framed archways. But they would have just had everybody, the servant, the man of the household, the wife, the children, the travellers that are staying there on the way somewhere else, would have had to have gone from one room to the other, passing everybody as they went. There would have been no sense of privacy in terms of a physical space. And then the corridor begins to separate, really create a new sense of separation. So servants can pick up your toilet pot and then take it down a corridor, so you don't have to see it. And you begin to get this kind of, rooms for particular purposes and a sense of separation within the home.
Yeah, I guess the way that they deal with that lack of physical separation with servants, for instance, is to have elaborate social practices of social separation and strict hierarchies, which we tend not now to have with the people who serve us. I mean, most people now don't have servants in their home, but you still have these relationships with, I don't know, people who serve you in shops or cleaners or nannies or whoever. Is much more egalitarian. Historically not true. I wonder if that's a way of compensating for the fact that the physical proximity is so, and the lack of physical privacy is so obvious.
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know if you've ever done anything like waitressing, but people will have the most private conversations in front of you. And that's because they almost don't see you as in their space. So they've made a sort of separation that you're not kind of intruding, even though you're listening in to him telling her something that you don't really want to know. I think that probably happened a fair bit. Although there are court cases around issues such as adultery where servants are giving evidence. And so I think they probably had, as well as the sort of manners and decorum, they probably had to have some sense of, are they trustworthy or not? And the same thing would work in reverse. So the lady of the house would know perhaps if one of the maids was pregnant. And you'd have to kind of have ways of keeping that secret between you. And so there would have been all sorts of sort of agreements, silent and not so silent, that I think took place within within those corridors and the four walls of a home.
Yeah, it's notable how often you see on antique furniture locks and keys.
Yeah, yes, and they do come in. Yes, and then you see the sort of all the novels that are about the letters that have got astray, that tell the details of private family secrets in particular.
Yeah, of course, we keep that on our phones now and our laptop. So that stuff is still locked up. It's just digitally locked. Yeah. And the idea of having anyone, even your spouse, just idly perusing your phone is quite...
It can feel like a violation.
It's not common at all. I mean, to the point where actually if you hear of, say, a husband who like routinely checks his wife's phone, that's normally regarded as quite concerning.
Yeah, probably coercive control of sorts. I mean, it would probably
that's what people worry about. Yeah, exactly. It's like rifling through your letter drawer in a previous century. Yeah. So what do you think it is about? So when the corridor emerges, it's almost this physical symbol of changing ideas about privacy. What do you think it is that triggers this? What's the historical event that makes people reconceptualize privacy?
I think firstly, we have to see it as political, in as much as what you have out of the kind of the religious wars and demands of public conformity towards a particular version of Protestantism or Catholicism. So you have these battles, particularly in England, but across Europe, and the way of living together peacefully, and also allowing a certain degree of religious diversity, is to create formally this private sphere where people can worship relatively freely. So it's almost like that happens prior to the corridor. And people are talking then about freedom of conscience and liberty of conscience and how do they follow their own faith. That quickly goes from being a discussion about religion to a discussion about intimate life. People start initially in the 18th century, very early on, talking about kind of freedom of conscience and how they have intimate relations, and you see a big change in sexual practices and quite a sort of this development of quite a bawdy, very sort of public sexual culture. So I think there's a degree to which it is because of beginnings of the freedom of the individual, the limiting of the state, and then the creation of this sort of intermediary space, which is the public sphere, where people have a sense of what a public is. They start talking about public criticism and public opinion, and at the same time, you see the sort of development of a private sphere, so somewhere that's separate from the state, separate from the public world, and has its own rules and values. So we talked earlier about sort of Athens, where you had quite a low opinion of the private realm, essential, necessary, but not this kind of place where man could excel and be the greatest thing that man can be, which is a political animal. But in the 18th century, you had this sense of a private realm which values the inner life, passions, emotions, intimacy. So the beginning of the 18th century, you have novels like Daniel Defoe's Robinson Crusoe, which is all about the quotidian, the kind of domestic pleasures of cooking. And then by the end of the century, you've got all those romantic novels, which, whether it's Austen or Pamela or Rousseau's Julie, that celebrate the heart and celebrate feelings and the private self. So there is this sense in which suddenly the private realm and the private aspect of the individual starts to become socially valued, socially validated.
The thing I always wonder about these social and intellectual changes that you see at this period is how much it probably had to do with affluence. This is kind of just my personal bugbear, but I always think that affluence is almost certainly at the heart of some social change. It must be. Do you think maybe it's... I mean, obviously people are able to, say, read novels because they can access relatively cheap printed books and so on. Are there other things going on as well? Maybe people have more space at home. Is women are less likely to be, I mean, because this is also a time when women's work is changing, so they're less likely to have this kind of corporate family structure, more likely to have the what will later be called the angel of the home emerging as an economic role. What do you think is going on there in terms of people's material existence?
So you've got the rise of mercantile society. A lot of the coffee houses begin really as a place to exchange information that has a kind of concrete impact upon men's livelihoods. It might be news of war or a ship going down and the fabric being lost at sea. So there's the exchange of information. There is at the same time this sort of the flurry of fashionable visiting. So with the rising affluence, people are buying tea, and tea is being this huge export that is being drunk in all the good homes. Women visiting, sort of this flurry also of social life. That's all premised on money. But I think it is, and so whilst it's this tremendous driver, I think it has to happen then rather than earlier. So rich people wouldn't have had this sense of privacy that happens in the 18th century, happens to develop in the 18th century. And I suppose the key thing there is the way in which you do get the beginnings of a nuclear family. And that is partly because the household is separated from the marketplace, and you don't need quite so many people in your home to reproduce really everything. People start going out to work, and so you do get this nuclear family form. That's premised on a certain level of social and economic development, but it's also given this sort of stamp of authority and legitimacy that it didn't have beforehand. In novels that just kind of talk about, particularly for women, this is the woman is essential in this reproduction of the next generation. She becomes much more key to running the family.
Yeah, and having dominion within this space. Should we talk about the Victorians? What
Yes.
was their innovation in relation to privacy?
I think it becomes a national value. There are numerous privacy scares about the etchings of Queen Victoria and Albert, or the letters of Italian nationalist called Giuseppe Mazzini, or over in the States, the growth of newspapers and urban society. And you have people like Henry James or Edith Wharton sort of writing about the dissolution of public and private, or worrying about it. And the most famous article in Privacy's history, The Right to Privacy. So it's a national value, and that's partly, I think, with urbanisation, the growth of the city, even the kind of the extension of the empire, where public life and urban life starts to be seen as almost hostile or dirty. And at the same time, the replenishing of society comes from the home, which is idealized. It's like a sort of little mini church. It's sacred. And so privacy protects the home. It protects the home from urban society, industrialization, but also from all sorts of kinds of intrusion, whether it's from the newspapers or your neighbors. And people write about the importance of fences and borders. When I say people, it might be domestic etiquette books talking about how you have to protect the home at all costs. And I think there's a sense in which bringing up the next generation is something that the family, and the mother in particular, has to do well and has to do right. And then the morals of the nation are tied to how the family is organized.
This urbanization point, I thought earlier when you mentioned being a waitress and the fact that people have private conversations in front of you, I thought, how true. But then I thought, I don't think people would do that in a village.
That's right.
So if you had gone to the local pub in an area that's quite socially static, you wouldn't talk about something really personal in front of the waitress. So I think so much of this must be the consequence of urbanization, that suddenly you're surrounded every day by strangers. I have never, the countless thousands of times I have been on the London Underground, and I have never run into anyone I know.
It
I
would
don't know
be
if you
weird. You
have.
just think, no, you're absolutely right. I don't think I
Yeah.
have. Yeah. You act differently. You act as if you're anonymous. I think if you look at sort of 18th and people writing about the 18th and 19th century, they do talk about people being question marks to each other and not knowing actually how to behave if you're walking down the street, because we don't know this person, so how do I tip my hat, and you have this sort of new rules.
That's a
And
nice expression.
yeah,
In terms of sort of social status, like, yeah, who's above who, and socioeconomically, or
it's partly that, because that would be a guide to behavior, but it is
yeah.
also like because you don't know their names. If in the village you would know that's John and that's Mary and they have these 4 children and they were rowing the other night, we could, you don't have that sort of tightly knit sense of who is who. And so you have much more of a sense of these free floating people. We just don't know how to behave with each other. I
Yeah.
think a tremendous sense of change as well,
Yeah.
that people must have experienced. Absolute influx of strangers into Manchester, into London in particular.
I've been writing an article about history of Cockneys recently, which speaking of which, actually, we mentioned the locks and keys thing earlier. As an important part of the sort of urban law around the East End in, say, the pre Second World War period, the kind of golden age of the East End. Of course, it wasn't. I mean, it was dreadful and it was poor and whatever. But there's this sense that there was a social solidarity that then was lost, and something that people will often talk about is not locking your door. And I went looking into this and found that it's half true, in the sense that people would typically live in tenements where there was a main front door and that would be locked. But within the building, people didn't lock their front doors. So you trusted your immediate neighbours enough to not lock your door typically, but not the whole of the city. So it was sort of, there's some truth to the myth, but it's not quite right. But the thing is with Cockneys, right, is like, obviously there have been working class people in London for as long as London has existed, and presumably there are people now who are descended from those people who can trace that lineage back all the way. But really, the Cockneys emerge as a 19th century. They're an Industrial Revolution phenomenon, because you suddenly have waves of people coming in from the countryside, including some of my ancestors who came from other parts of Britain and then became Cockneys. It's easy to forget now how much cities changed in that century, and how disorientating that was.
And I think there was a great concern as well, particularly from the middle classes, about how people lived then, and particularly the working classes. And they, as you alluded to, they were probably quite unpleasant, very poor people living on top of each other. But there was a certain freedom and solidarity between those people, that when people walked in to I can't remember what they were called, particularly dense area of London, which was
Rookeries.
I think so, yeah.
These kind of they're kind of like flats, but they, at the brink of falling down kind of thing.
People describe them almost like honeycomb. They're so kind of tightly knit. And there was attempts to, they destroyed them to pave the way for Oxford Street. I think that was a very well-known one. But there was a lot of resistance. There was a lot of resistance of people coming in to tell them how to live. Don't drink. Do you beat your wife? Etc. Etc. Questions that they were constantly asked. So they might have ended up with better housing, but they felt less free, and the solidarity perhaps was
more
eroded.
Surveilled. Yeah. I mean, you can see why this anxiety among social reformers came about, because one of the things that rural societies can do is they can keep a check on people.
Yes, you can overhear each other, and he maybe does drink too much and he should go home now.
Yeah.
You don't get that in the city. You have freedom.
So it's out of these material conditions that you then get the Victorian prizing of, I suppose there's some hypocrisy there, isn't there? Because on the one hand, you have middle-class Victorians very eagerly prying into the private lives of the working classes, but then protecting their own private space fiercely.
Very much so. And you can see that privacy meant that behind closed doors, all sorts of things could, and in fact did, happen that were not possible in public in Victorian society. So, unnatural crimes, adultery. Although it's interesting to think of people like, John Stuart Mill and Harriet Taylor being a fairly well publicised affair in Victorian society. So there's a certain degree of hypocrisy there, but I think it does that separation between public and private gave people a certain degree of freedom. And there are many, and there you begin to see also certain laws around wife beating begin to come in the 19th century because of those social reformers.
Yeah. You mentioned Queen Victoria and Prince Albert's etchings earlier. Do you want to tell that story as an example of this?
Well, it's quite interesting because they were great etchers, and the sort of pictures they did might be of their dogs or landscape. There are a few of the Queen with her daughter, it's a drawing. Her daughter with her back with just the back of her daughter. So they're not, well, we wouldn't look at them and say, oh gosh, those are really intimate. They wanted to send them out and make a book of etchings for some friends, and in doing so somebody stole them and wanted to print them for an exhibition, so without their permission. And when they wrote to Albert and Victoria to effectively ask their permission, somewhat optimistically after the fact, Albert went to court and prevented it from happening. I think what's interesting about it is the whole public discussion of it. It's seen as a violation. Although they kind of strike it down on questions of intellectual property and how the guy actually got the etchings, it's very much seen as this sort of invading the sacred family home, not just because they're kings and queens, but because it's the home. It's the most kind of inviolate space that people should never kind of lift the curtain to see. I think that sort of is one of many privacy scandals that show how it was a kind of privacy was a prize, and it was very much valued and seen as essential. It was almost, so it's interesting when how do you think about concepts that have the same word? We use the word privacy all the time, but it's a protean concept. It means very different things at different times, and it has different values. So in the 17th century, sort of 200 years earlier, it was a frightening and dangerous thing. Privacy. It was only for murderers and adulterers, in the words of a 17th century preacher. And so fast forward 200 years, this scandal is one of many that shows that privacy is seen as essential to the ordering of society and the self. It's seen as the modern self needs privacy, is the way in which sort of Victorians and their contemporaries see privacy. It's completely different to 200 years earlier. There is that quite interesting case about State versus Rose, which is a legal case in the States, where a woman, Elizabeth Warren, takes her husband to court for beating her. And he says, yes, I beat her, but she is my wife. And she said something, I can't remember exactly what it was, but it annoyed me. And the judge comes back and says, okay, so we know, yes, you did beat her, but it would be a greater wrong to invade your privacy and the privacy of the home than the wrong that you committed. And it's really interesting. His explanation is really interesting because it essentially talks about the way in which in going into the home, and he even talks about sort of raising the curtain, is more destructive, really, and it turns private trifles into like public matters, and they're to be resolved within the home.
I'm no expert on this, but I believe that in mid-20th century America, abortion was considered by most Protestants to be a private family matter. So it wasn't that they approved of abortion per se. It wasn't as if, having lots of premarital sex and then using abortion as contraceptive was good. It was more that it was consigned to, it's the decision that husbands and wives make. And I think that part of the reason that became a sort of sectarian division is because opposition to abortion was conceived of as Catholic. And this is at an era where there's a lot of Catholic immigration and a certain degree of of tension around that before JFK is elected, which is strange now, because now the strongest pro-life energy actually comes from Protestant America.
Yeah. No, I think that's right. I think it's actually really interesting, because you look at sort of even up into the 60s, many Republicans take that view, and evangelicals also take that view, which is they're not, it's not split down party lines, and there's a move really towards respecting a woman's requirement to have abortion if necessary. But it is seen as a matter for somebody's own private conscience, a private matter, not a public issue. And I think one of the unfortunate things that actually does happen is that by turning these things into sort of public matters, it does invite people in to adjudicate on people's private decisions. And now it's just become a product of the culture wars, really. And that I think sort of left-wing feminists did really open that up with the personal as political and politicizing the private realm. And then I think later you saw, in fact, with the way Reagan goes, he is initially open to abortion and later isn't. And there's a kind of grassroots rebellion that people like Phyllis Schlafly are able to harness, and turning these sort of private matters into public issues. And we have the difficulty we have with abortion today. I also think, Judge Bader Ginsburg was quite good on this. She said, when you made the right to abortion, when you tried to claim it as a constitutional right, which is what they did in the States, rather than a state issue, you also politicized it unhelpfully and gave it a sort of greater attention than it needed or it required. And it should probably have just been a public provision that states decided than what it became.
Yeah, given that the modal American actually has a very moderate view of abortion, and yet it is managed, to be a very, very heated political question.
So feminists like Betty Friedan used to talk about it in terms of freedom, but then they later started talking about they campaigned for it as a kind of constitutional right on the basis of privacy. I think that was a short-term win for them, but a long-term problem.
Yeah, well, as we've seen lately. Should we get on to the consciousness raising era of the second wave, which of course birthed the phrase you've already used, the personal is political?
Yes. So one of the reasons why I wanted to sort of look at this question about public and private and privacy is that people talk about it in terms of the internet coming along and just taking it all away. And I was more interested in the way in which the divide between public and private had been eroded over the course of the 20th century. So initially with a type of kind of behaviorism, which allowed elites to sort of intrude into people's private lives, and then changes in the left, really away from changing society towards the personal. If you read the people from the SDS, Students for Democratic Society, they start talking about authenticity and realizing the best version of ourselves, sort of really from the sort of 60s onwards. So something's already changing there in people's character and political activism. And then there's that particular strand of radical feminism with people like Carol Hanisch and Kate Millett that start to see the private realm as the explanation for women's oppression and subjugation, and the opening up of family life as the solution. So Kate Millett talks a lot about language, the patriarchy, families being really the problem. And so you get this sort of opening up of the family for political ends then.
In a way, I suppose it's something that would be recognisable to a much earlier era, this intense examination of one's own conscience and one's own thinking and interrogating it in a political way rather than in a religious way, which is what we'd be more familiar with.
That's right. And I think if you think of somebody also like Rousseau, who's very much, and that sort of what I talk about, the way in which in the 18th century people start thinking about emotions and that being a kind of a source of the self, you see that politicized in the 20th century. And I think it comes with a disillusionment with left-wing movements for wider social progress. There's somebody called Paul Lazarsfeld, who's a Viennese social scientist who moves to the States, and he sort of talks about, so in the context of failure of all sorts of sort of revolutions, then we need to start looking at our minds and start maybe just changing. It's very much a lowering of expectations into the self.
Cynically, I think it's quite good for media in that you can produce sort of endless content on this theme. It's a sort of and the shift towards feminism. I mean, it wasn't even a shift because, of course, people like Gloria Steinem, they're producing Ms. Magazine. There's always an element of kind of commercial media involvement in this political movement, and I think readers are endlessly interested in this minutiae of one's own emotional life and that of others.
And I think it took, if I think of something like David Reisman's work, which is a 1950s sociologist who in sort of 30s published an extensive study called Middletown, which is of a place in America called Idaho. And it was like just an anthropological, sociological study of the changes that was happening. Their reports sold out. I mean, it was just a huge success, but they hadn't anticipated that. So I think what you see then is a sort of, I think Good Housekeeping reviews it and says, nothing is so interesting as reading about yourself. People are much more interested in reading about themselves. And that's happening, I think, as other sources of authority are in abeyance. So religion and kind of tradition, and there's new forms of media, television, radio. And so that kind of inward, almost sort of backward looking, as in looking backward in history, looking back to your forefathers, your parents, is in decline as there are other sources of authority of media and your peers, and you start looking a lot more outwards. And Reisman describes it as you go from having an internal gyroscope to an external one. So you become sort of less kind of inner focused and more projecting, performing, and that sort of, and he's talking about that in the 1950s.
This is not the end of the episode. Actually, we're only halfway through, but the rest of the show is behind a paywall. In the extended version, Tiffany and I spoke about the demonising of the private sphere that occurred during the 1970s, what the Clinton-Lewinsky scandal revealed about attitudes towards privacy, and contemporary conflicts over the increasing intrusion of the therapeutic state into the private lives of its subjects, i.e. all of us. While you can, of course, listen to MMM wherever you get your podcasts, the true home of the show is to be found at louiseperry.substack.com. That's where you can find not only the extended version of this episode, but also the extended versions of hundreds of MMM podcasts, the MMM chat community, plus the weekly bonus episodes I record with other Substackers, including Rob Henderson, Megan Murphy, Nina Power, and Ed West. This is a listener-supported podcast. I'm utterly reliant on paid subscribers to produce the show and keep the lights on. If you find Maiden Mother Matriarch valuable, the most helpful possible thing you can do is go to louiseperry.substack.com and sign up to become a paid subscriber for either $8 a month or $79 a year. Without paid subscribers, I really wouldn't be able to produce the podcast. So if you're willing to join their ranks, this is the key way that you can support me and support the show. Thank you.